Washington. Congressman, thank you for taking a few minutes. Keep hearing this refrain in the last 24 hours, and I think we've heard it after a lot of these other shootings. Do something. Those two words, do something. You want Congress to come back early. What specifically do you want Congress to do about this?
Well, Steve, first let me just say people are shaken and scared around this country. Let's just recount the facts. Yesterday, a mass shooting, 7 dead, a 17-month-old toddler shot in the face. 2 days before that, and Friday in Alabama, a mass shooting at a high school football game where 10 people were injured. And it's just been 5 weeks since we had the mass shooting near my district in Gilroy, since we had a shooting after that in El Paso, and then in Dayton. When I talk to people back home, here's what they say. All of you, you're too timid, you are being too cautious, you don't get the urgency, be bold. We're sick of the politics. Get something done, and we can do something. Speaker Pelosi should call back the Congress tomorrow. It's Labor Day. Let Congress actually work on Labor Day, and don't let us out. Let's have a vote on the assault weapons ban. Let's have a vote on banning high-capacity magazines. Let's vote on every single gun violence bill and stay in that chamber until those votes are done.
You mentioned there the idea of being bold, of not being cautious. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but Beto O'Rourke, your former colleague there, presidential candidate right now, we say this was an AR-15 type weapon that was used here in Odessa. He says take every AR-15 in the country, every AK-47, and make them subject to a mandatory buyback. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think what we ought to do is have an assault weapons ban, and we are on bills that would have a voluntary buyback for those weapons. But the first thing we need actually is a ban on the assault weapons, and we haven't had a vote for 1 year. We haven't had a vote on an actual ban, and we know this ban works. How do we know? Because President Clinton had it in 1994, and mass shootings were down. Mass shootings have gone up over 170% since that ban expired. So my view is let's have all of this gun violence legislation for a vote, and let's force every member to vote up or down on every piece of legislation.
There is the question, of course, Democrats control the House. You're the majority party there. If you so choose, you could introduce, you could bring to the floor, have votes on, and maybe even pass a lot of what you're talking about. But Republicans control the Senate. Do you think anything is going to change in terms of the Senate's willingness, the Republican Senate's willingness to consider and potentially support any of this?
Well, we can't just sit back and say, let's not do anything, let's just wait for the Senate. I mean, the people in this country gave us the majority for a reason, to try to bring change, to try to get something done. We've got to show that we are willing to do everything in our power. And I do think if we had a dramatic moment, if the Speaker said, look, we're not going to let anyone out until we're voting on this legislation, the media would cover that 24/7, and it would put an enormous amount of pressure on the Senate. I have such admiration when Speaker Pelosi stood on the House floor for 8 hours to speak up for the Dreamers. We need something dramatic, urgent, that matches the moment. I mean, there is palpable frustration out there, and they think Congress is paralyzed, and we've got to reassure them that we get it, and we're going to give it everything we have. And I don't think people sense that we're doing that yet.
I note here that the House Judiciary Committee, Democrats who run that, did have in mind something similar to what you're talking about. They had planned to come back early. I think they had hearings scheduled, a meeting scheduled for this coming Wednesday. They just announced, I think in the last 2 days, they're going to have to postpone that just because of this hurricane and wait till September 9th. Just logistically, does the hurricane that we're talking about so much tonight hinder what you're calling for?
Well, Steve, two things. One, of course, members who are affected by the hurricane in Florida or North Carolina, they don't have to come. Let's call Congress in session tomorrow, begin the debates, and we can postpone the votes for a couple days to allow those members to come. But second, with due respect, we don't need more hearings in the Judiciary Committee. I don't think there's a person in this country who thinks that we need more hearings and debate about what an assault weapons ban should look like. We know what the bill should look like. These bills have been written. What we need is more urgency, and what we need is more courage. I would just bring these bills up for a vote straight on the House. You can do that. The Judiciary Committee could waive their jurisdiction, have every member of Congress debate it, and this coming week, let's have votes on 10 different pieces of gun legislation. Let's know where every single member stands on every piece of legislation so that the public can decide.
And have you had any contact with Speaker Pelosi, with anybody in Democratic leadership, anybody on their staff about this?
I sent Speaker Pelosi a text, and I have been in communication with people on her staff. I think this is a moment where she could really answer the nation's call, speak to people's anger, frustration. People are scared. They don't understand what's happening to our country. I mean, this is not supposed to happen in the United States of America. And public officials, this is why you get into public office. We need to do something, and we need to assure people that we are going to act.
And what do you, just quickly here, what do you think of the politics of this? Because, again, unfortunately, these mass casualty situations have been, if not common, they have been a regular occurrence over the last a couple of decades. I remember after Sandy Hook 2012, there was a push back then for background checks. It failed in the Senate. There was talk, the polling certainly suggested the public was all on board with background checks. There was talk that there would be ramifications at the ballot box for anybody who'd been against that. There weren't. Nobody who had stopped it in 2013 was defeated in 2014. Do you think the politics have changed at all since then?
I do. You have Mike Turner, the congressperson who was affected by Dayton, who has now come out for an assault weapons ban. You have the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, who has now come out for some gun violence laws. So I think the politics are changing. Unfortunately, they're changing often in communities that have faced these mass shootings. And we shouldn't have more of these mass shootings before we get the politics to change. I do believe, though, there is something about leadership. And it's not enough for us just to tweet something out or to say we're for it or to say we passed a background check and just to say, OK, we're going to wait for the Senate. We need to show people that this is a high priority, that we're going to fight for it, that we're not going to stop talking about it.
All right, Congressman Khanna, thank you for taking a few minutes.
Thank you, Steve.